Yo, what up? This is your boy, Pastor Tim Allison of Reconciled Church, and this is episode number 1 of Unapologetically Black and Unashamedly Christian. Today, we want to deal with the topic that is centered around the idea that I, as a black man, am only a Christian because it was beaten into my ancestors during the time of slavery. No doubt you probably run across memes like this one right here, or this one. And we have to look at now, forget about the classic, this one right here. So that's what we want to deal with today. Is it possible that the only reason that I am a Christian is because my ancestors that were taken from the coast of Africa were enslaved and Jesus was just beating into them? Or perhaps, maybe there's another view. So we're gonna take some time and answer that today. So I want you to just hold on tight. It's finna get deep. It's finna get like really, really deep. So I want you to hold on, put the baby down, turn the TV off, like man, put the book up and pay attention because we're finna answer that question right now. Right now. We're about to answer that question. Are you ready? Are you ready? All right, here's my answer to that. No. Oh, that's not enough? Oh, yeah, probably because my opinion about the matter doesn't really matter, kind of like the opinion of the memes that we were looking at earlier. So let's kind of just dive in a little bit and just take a quick stab at it today and just explore this idea of how I became a Christian as a black man. Now, it is known that most of the men and women that were enslaved were taken from West Africa. But we also see early on, we see Christianity thriving in North Africa way prior to the transatlantic slave trade. We see this in deep, far, long stretching history, like with places like Nubia and Ethiopia. And it may have been some kind of, through trade and things of that sort, some interaction with the North and the West. But it is also a plausible idea that some of the men and women who were enslaved and came to America didn't have an interaction with Christianity prior to coming to America, except for, you can look up something that was called the Stono Rebellion in 1793 that happens in South Carolina, where they actually kind of quote that part of the rebellion, or the people that were rebellion, were enslaved people who were actually had some association with Christianity prior to coming to America. But to really try to dive into the question, I first want to say that like we can't make it a common rule for all and to say that all people who were enslaved people became Christian the same exact way. And that's what I want to just kind of explore and look at today. One thing that I think is important is when we have a conversation about somebody, I think that we ought to, as opposed to having our own opinions about it, we ought to bring those people to the table. So the first thing I want to look at in trying to wrestle with this question about us being Christians only because of our ancestors being enslaved and Jesus being whipped and beaten to them, I want to pull out a couple slave narratives and look at what actual human encounters have to say for themselves. So the first slave narrative I want to look at is my man Thomas Anderson, from the Interesting Account of Thomas Anderson. And he is quoted by saying, and bear with me, I got a little bit to read, but just bear with me. I'll try to throw a couple slides up here so we can follow along together. But quoting him, he says, "My master who owned me at that time, having no knowledge of God or godliness, supposed my religion was all a fancy, and said he could whip it out of me. He took me up and tied me and scourged me until feeling of flesh was almost gone. At length I fall before him and lift up my eyes to heaven and ask my great creator, what have I done? My master cursed me and said, will you preach to me? But I now feel glad that I could suffer patiently for my new master. And my manner at that time takes master's strength away. And before he could untie me and let me off, but in 3 hours he come again and threatened me with fresh scourging. And though I was very weak from the beating I got, the Lord make me feel very strong, and this prepare me to answer. You have whipped out all fear, and I am not afraid of you no more. You can take a gun and shoot me or kill me as you please, and all for nothing, and that is all you can do. For I know I have life you cannot touch, and the fear that you will not keep me from doing anything my new master tells me to do. And if he let you take this poor bruised body of flesh, I feel it ain't worth much. And I feel strength to say something like this: Thy will, O God, be done and not mine. After this, my old master was conquered and never whipped me again and left me in the hands of Jehovah. So we look at just this one slave narrative, and what we see is that actually it was the contrary. Actually, we have this slave master who's not a believer in Jesus, and we have a slave who is actually practicing Christianity, and the slave master tries to beat the Christianity out of him, not try to beat it into him. And the Bizrat, you'll hear me say Bizrat for the word gospel, and you'll hear me say also hear me say Nazarene for the term Christian. The Bizrat, or the good news of Jesus, actually empowers the slave to stand against his master, because he understands that though you have some kind of precedence over me, that there is a new master I serve. There is one who is greater than you. And this not only empowers him, it also threatens and pushes back, gives resistance to the slave master. And now he gets to practice Christianity freely. Quite different than some of the memes we looked at earlier that would suggest that we were just dumb and docile and just didn't know what to do, and therefore the slave master gave us Jesus. No, in all actuality, in this just simple narrative right here, we see that, man, it was the slave who was standing upon, he was the Nazarene who was standing upon the Bizrat, and it empowered him and strengthened him to stand against the persecution that he was facing and the injustice that he was facing, even in the time where his life was being threatened, to the point that we was like, man, listen, because of what I know of what is after, I will stand for what is right now. And if we really look and do a good examination of the Bible, we'll see that Jesus was always on the side of the oppressed, but that's another subject for another day. And we look and we see that we got to kind of examine just the situation around. Like there were times where slave masters, no doubt, they would put up other slaves, or they would have other people come and preach, and it was designed to keep slaves just kind of in bondage, you know. So we don't want to just glaze over history. No, the reality of it is that there were slave masters who utilized the Bible in order to try to enslave people, but they also used a lot of different methods. And I would go to say that they were misrepresenting the Bible in the most terrible way. They were not preaching Christianity at all. But they would have people come and preach to the slaves and say, you know, hey, just don't steal from your master, don't take from your master, and all these different type things. And actually, you can even look up something that's called the Slave Bible, where they actually took out like narratives of freedom and joy and resistance, in fear that if they were able to read this and able to understand this, that they would revolt. And we actually see some of that kind of play out in history. But I want to stay right here on this line where we're at right now. So they would put these people up to preach this false gospel and this false narrative, but the slaves would actually have things that were called hush harbors or night meetings, where they would meet afterwards and they would preach to themselves the true gospel of Jesus Christ, the true Bizrat. So we gotta look at this. We gotta kind of wrestle with this and say, man, you know what? There was some ills that were done, but we want to represent all of this in a fair and a balanced and a true way. We just want to read another slave narrative to you from a man, John Thompson. Okay, John Thompson, and once again, I got a kind of a lengthy quote, so just please follow along with me. He says, fiddling and dancing being done away among the slaves by the disappearance of Martin Fiddles, Christianity seemed to gain ground, and glorious revival of religion sprang up, which required another legal provision to suppress. This was the new provision, that the patrollers should search the slave quarters on every plantation, from whence, if they found any slave absent after nightfall, they should receive, when found, 39 lashes upon the naked back. So what they were doing was, if the slaves were going at nighttime, they were to be punished, and they actually put new laws and provision in place because the slaves were becoming Christians and they were hearing the gospel the way that the gospel was supposed to be preached, the way that the Bizrat was supposed to be preached, because they were having night meetings. And if you go on in this quote, you'll see that John Thompson talks about how they would be getting beatings on their way to night meetings, and they would also be getting beatings on their way back from night meetings, and sometimes they'll be pulled off of their knees from prayer and get beatings. This is contrary. They were not trying to beat Christianity into the slaves. We have some narratives here that give kind of a counter view to that in all actuality, they're practicing Christianity, the fact that they were Christians, real Nazarari, really seeking the Bizrat, really letting that be the thing that is empowering them through the most treacherous times that they are experiencing, that in all actuality they were being threatened to be beaten. And let me just say this here too. Let us be careful in the way that we represent our ancestors. We have to be careful not to represent them in a way where they were just deaf, dumb, blind, and stupid, and had no idea that where they could distinguish the difference between right and wrong. They understood that, like, man, what this dude is saying or what these people are saying about what they believe is not lining up to the way that they're living this particular thing out. And I think we do a discredit and a dishonor to our ancestors to treat them in such a way. If we could just really quickly here, look at my man Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass gives us a clear view of understanding and distinguishing the difference between the Christianity, so-called Christianity, that was being practiced and the true Christianity or the true Bizrat in which we are to embrace. And he says, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. He says it is so wide that to receive one as good and pure and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be a friend to one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. Like, so they understood like the difference between what was true Christianity and what was this fabricated, made up Christianity that was utilized to enslave, to plunder, to beat, to kill, to steal. All these things were contrary to what the gospel actually preaches, and they were well aware of that. Now, we once again, I just got to kind of throw back in there. I'm not saying that this is the norm for everybody. I'm not saying that this is everybody's encounter with Christianity or every slave encounters with Christianity. Just like no doubt in today, everybody who professes to be a Christian didn't come there through the same way or the same means, and also are not ascribing to true fundamental Christian belief. We can even look back in history and see that there was laws at the time that it was unfit, that if you were a Christian, you were unfit to be a slave, which I don't agree with because I don't think anybody is fit to be a slave. But you can see narratives of actually slaves converting to Christianity, being baptized, and now making a legal appeal for their freedom off the basis that they are now a Christian. So we see that people just had different interactions with Christianity, but to say that the reason that I, right here today, am a Christian is because it was beat into my ancestors, well, when I look at the record, I look at the account, I don't see that to be the only exclusive way that somebody was introduced to Christianity, which now beckons the question, why or how am I Nazarari? How am I a Christian today? I'm glad you asked that. If we look at the biblical text, we see the realities of what it expressed. In Romans, the 3rd chapter and the 23rd verse, it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. What I recognize and what all of us recognize, whether we ascribe to the Christian faith or not, is that we see that, man, there's some jacked up stuff and some messed up stuff in the world. There's some jacked up stuff and some messed up stuff in me. It is when I look at this holy and perfect and righteous God that is the standard for that which is holy and right. He isn't just trying to be right or acquiring righteousness. He is the very definition of perfection and holiness. That is his nature and his character. When I look at how I measure towards that, I see that there is some deficiency and some depravity in me that has caused not only turmoil to me personally, but has also damaged people around me and damaged society around me. And I see that I contribute to the ills of society and the ills of the world. And I see that I'm not measuring up to this holy and perfect God, which now puts me in a situation to say, now, what do I do now? And if we continue to read on, we see in Romans, the 5th chapter in the 8th verse, it says, but God provided his own love towards us, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. So what I believe is that the answer to my sin nature and the answer to my rebellious nature is found in the reality that while I was still out here wilding out and messed up, and I still got some issues now, and he's still working on us and continually shaping us to his character and his nature. But I believe that the only thing that makes me right before God is the fact that God himself, that Jesus, fully God, fully man, came to this world, gave his life so that I may have life. And that righteousness that I have is not one that I can brag about. It's not something that I can talk about. It's not something that man gave to me, but it was something that the Lord himself has extended to me. And the righteousness that I have is in him and not in me. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 says, therefore, you were saved by grace through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is God's gift, not from works that no man can boast. So I believe that God is about his glory. That the reason that I am a Christian has nothing to do with history or future. The reason why I am a Christian is because God has saved me, taken this heart of stone and made it a heart of flesh, given me a righteousness that can only be found in him, and there's no space for me to boast. I don't believe that it's by the hands of man that I am a Christian today. And we find this when we look at Peter on the coast of Caesarea Philippi. When Jesus comes and asks the disciples, he says, well, who do men say that I am? And then some said that you're John the Baptist, some said Elijah, some said Jeremiah, one of the other prophets, and all this stuff. And Jesus says, well, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And nobody says anything, but Peter gets up and says that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says something that I think we ought to take hold to today. He said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood is not the thing that has taught you this. It is not by the standards of man. It's not because of what man did or what he did not do that you came to the revelation of who I am. He says, but it was only by my Father who has revealed to you who I am. In that essence, we can see that the bizrod cannot be beaten into anyone, and nor when we look at the slave narratives, we can see it not being even beaten out of them, because there's an inner working of the heart that has changed and transformed, and that's why I am a Christian today. It has nothing to do with any of that, but if we look at history, we would also see that it is erroneous to say that even just looking at the historical narrative, because everybody's experience was not the same. Even if you look at the Negro spirituals, you will see, as they were singing these songs of community, that there were no Negro spirituals that actually were looking at God as this affirming God of slavery or this affirming God of oppression. You don't see that being the common theme when they their view of God and their view of Jesus. And shout out to Adam Coleman, and you can go check him out at True ID Podcast on YouTube for a more in-depth look at how slavery was interacting with Christianity. So make sure to go check him out. But when we look at it, we have to look and see that the Bizrod, the gospel of Jesus Christ, was empowering the slaves. And one thing we have to do is stop looking at our ancestors as if they were just deaf, dumb, and blind and had no idea or understanding of what was going on. That's not the lineage that we come from. We come from a lineage of perseverance. We come from a lineage of strength. We come from a lineage of people who have been through some of the most horrendous acts that there is, and yet have still maintained and persevered throughout it. And many of the pioneers that were leading through this were people who had their faith in Jesus Christ. And that's just the record right there. And we just have to be honest about that. So as I get ready to leave out of here, I just want to leave you with the words of my man Birdman. When we talk about our ancestors, let us make sure to put some respect on their name. Peace.